Thank you. Thanks, Perry. For people who don't know, Dr. Perry Klein is our Associate Vice Dean for Research at the Faculty of Education, and it's through his office that this initiative has been started. So thank you very much. I think it's great that we're able to engage with people outside of the university, and also just to bring our ideas to you and for us to get feedback, because that's one of the main things that drives us. So today I'm going to be speaking about some work I'm doing on philanthropy and private investment in education, in global education. Most of my work focuses on countries, low income, lower middle income countries, or countries that we would broadly construe as the global south. And this is a long-standing interest of mine. I've been doing work on this in these countries for almost 20 years. And so the work that I'm looking at right now stems from a much broader research agenda. And it comes from partly a grant that I was funded through the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And part of this work was also co-funded by the Brookings Institution, which is a large think tank in the US. So having said that, what I'd like to do is just to draw your attention before we begin more formally to these. These are headlines, they're actual headlines from news sources and press releases of what the topic that I'm speaking about, what are some of the issues that are framing this larger work? Why am I even interested in this? And if you just take some time to look at them, I think a few questions might pop up, right? Is in terms of why is the question of private investment, why the question of philanthropy so important, and impact investment so important when we start looking at questions that have to do with access, equity, and quality issues in the global south when we talk about education. So this just sums up some of the controversy, some of the big headlines that have come up in the last few years that actually orient the position of what it is that I'm going to be discussing today. And what I'd like to start with is a conversation about big ideas, right? So every research agenda, and particularly mine, is centered around big ideas. And then what we do is focus on one or two particular aspects of that big idea in order for us to make some change, in order for us to make some headway in understanding that big idea. So big idea number one is the right to education. And just over 70 years ago, there was a big idea that all people have the right to education. It was enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And since then, the international community has convened numerous times in attempts to advance this right globally. Most recently, the international community has committed to advancing the global right to education by 2030. And that is primarily through the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all and to promote lifelong learning. So there's been an international compact that has been made around 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And what I'm really focused on is S4. Is the right to education and equitable and quality education. So domestic governments or country governments around the world have made substantial efforts to try and advance this goal by 2030. That's the target that the international community has adopted. We have more schools, we have more schools, and we have more children in schools now than in any point in history. And I think it's really important to understand that that's a huge achievement globally for children and young adults. And that really must be celebrated. But there are some serious threats to this big idea. And what are those threats? So those threats are talked about in two very different but parallel ways. The first is the global learning crisis, or it has been termed as a global learning crisis. What is this? This is a realization that globally, 263 million children and adolescents are out of school. Despite the progress that we've made, we still have a substantial number of children who remain out of school. And more than that, 407 million school-going children, adolescents, and children do not master basic skills. Okay? So there's an issue there. It's not just about the fact that we have children who are out of school. We have children who attend school sometimes for 4 years and cannot master the basic skills globally. Right? This is what's being termed as the global learning crisis. Anytime you see that, that's kind of the shorthand to refer to. Alongside that, we have global funding gaps. And these are gaps that have not been met in terms of education finance, both domestically within countries, but also by international aid agencies and donors. And what we know about that is that 1/4 of countries, or 1 in 4 countries, do not meet the education expenditure targets that we have set internationally, right? So 1 in 4 countries are not financing education to the level that we expect them to, or we would like them to. And aid for education, that means the foreign assistance, international assistance that donor countries give, is stagnated and has stagnated for education since 2010. Between 2010 and 2017, there's been a period of decline and stagnation, other than only 1 year in which there was an increase, which was, I think, 2016. That says something in terms of thinking about the commitment that international governments are making to solving these crises, and wondering whether or not that's just lip service, right? Because we all have targets. Most of these donor countries are operating within larger frameworks with targets for how much expenditure there should be going to aid generally, and how much we would like to see go to education. The other part of this story, which is increasingly becoming more and more apparent, is that half of those children who are out of school are from conflict-affected contexts. And as we all know, there have been resurgencies and insurgencies of conflict in different parts of the world. And we've noticed that that has increased in terms of the number of children who are actually affected by that and who have disrupted schooling as a result. But even though half of the children who are out of school are in those contexts, only 2% of the aid that's targeted for humanitarian response goes to education. Right? So that's a huge gap in terms of funding, need, and what we're talking about in terms of this learning crisis. Now, I have to be honest, some people don't like calling it a learning crisis, but it's the term that has caught fire in the global education policy community. So what does that mean? That leads us to big idea number 2. And that big idea is the private sector as savior. Right? So why are we looking at the private sector as savior? A few reasons. One, it's prompted attention on the private sector as a source, as a potential source, from which to leverage additional funds, right? We talk about the financing gap. And the second is as a potential innovator for change. When we say that children are experiencing a global learning crisis, or the world is experiencing a global learning crisis, what we're saying is that there's something wrong with the quality of schooling that's being provided globally. And we need to spark change. We need to spark innovation. And one of the ways that's being proposed is to actually look at the private sector as a potential savior in that regard. What can we learn from the private sector? How can the private sector infuse innovation? Okay, that's the discourse. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just telling you this is the discourse of why it is that we think of the private sector as savior. Now, as an idea, the private sector as savior has gained traction. But there is evidence and research evidence that shows that, for example, private sector does not always operate in the areas that are most needed. There are few incentives for private sector to operate in countries which are low-income countries, which are politically less stable, which don't have as developed markets for education. And the other thing that we're seeing is even though we look at the private sector as a catalyst, as a potential catalyst to infuse more resources in education, in fact, the investment is dwarfed by what domestic governments spend on education, and also even if you look at aid to education. So it's not able to supplement the gap that we need to the degree that we need. Still, the idea persists. And there is still, despite these two caveats, there is still a pretty large incentive for private sector, and particularly those actors that seek to have some kind of a return on their investment to operate in certain education, in certain fields, and particularly in certain markets. Why? Because we know that if, well, we don't know, we estimate that by 2030, perhaps we'll have $10 trillion global education industry or market. That has a big resonance with certain kinds of private sector investors. Particularly, I don't know if any of you have heard about venture capitalists or ed tech hubs, or certain kinds of more commercial enterprises that enter the space. So those are the two big ideas that my research is trying to actually look at, and look at from a perspective to understand, okay, what are the dynamics of private investment? Who are the players? And what are they doing? Where are they operating? Are they addressing needs? What kinds of needs are they addressing? Just to get below the surface of some of these broader discourses. So the question here is, you might be asking yourself, this is great, thank you very much. Nice work you're doing. Why should I care? Why should we care, right? And by we, I really mean those of us who are not immediately implicated in the education systems of countries in the global south. Why should we actually care? And it's a question that I don't usually ask because I feel that I'm working in those areas and I'm committed to those areas, but it certainly is a very important question to ask as members of the public, as consumers of research, and also as taxpayers whose money goes to Global Affairs Canada, who also invests internal assistance in education, right? These are important questions to know. Why should we care? Well, I think there are three reasons why we should care, three big reasons. The first is we should care because we're increasingly interconnected. As humanity, we are increasingly interconnected with other parts of the world globally. And we are in need of skilled and qualified professional people power. We are increasingly looking globally to meet our needs. But more than that, we should care on a human level. We should care because it matters what happens to children, young adults, and adults who are marginalized in all of the world, right? That's a commitment that I think most of us would feel some resonance to as human beings. But the other reason we should care, and perhaps it's a little bit more instrumental, is because big ideas travel. And they travel increasingly quickly in today's interconnected world. I'll give you an example in terms of private sector engagement. In recent years, perhaps in the last 15 or 20 years, the Global South and countries of the Global South have been a little bit of a testing ground for certain kinds of ideas. For-profit provision, government-backed for-profit provision of schooling, contracting out teachers, scripted curricula, these kinds of ideas. Some of them are invested heavily by private sector actors. Some of them are invested in partnership with government, taxpayer dollars, with international donors, right? One example is operators of what we call private school chains, right? Chains of private schools. Some of these might be profit oriented. Well, there's an operator who started schools in Ghana and India, and who's now starting the same model in the UK. Right? And that model might be brought here. We don't. But the point is, those ideas, they travel because they're traveling on this idea of discourse. Big idea number 2, private sector phases. That's the first reason. But the other reason that we should also care is big ideas can take hold incrementally. We don't even see them coming sometimes, right? Slight changes in terminology here, modifications to some processes there, a few experiments and pilot programs just to test new ideas here and there. They add up and they can add up to big transformations over time. In Ontario, we're hearing some of these sounds right now in education. You might have heard the threat to public school teacher cuts. Yeah, you might have heard or witnessed more parents sending their children to private for-profit tutoring companies, right? You might have heard government using ideas like contracting certain services out to private sector in our education, in our public education systems. You might be hearing questions around value for money investment. Right? These are all ideas that are traveling globally. And they're not specific sometimes to boundaries, but the way they're implemented in particular contexts will be specific to that particular region. Right? So what can we learn from what I'm researching when we're thinking about private investment and private engagement? So the study that I was doing was looking at philanthropic and impact investors in Asia. Philanthropic investors are basically private foundations, right? These are not-for-profit organizations. They usually have an endowment. They have their own funds, usually. They're usually led by a board or an independent CEO. And they can be individual private foundations. They can be family private foundations. They can be corporate private foundations. Corporations can set up their own foundations. Or they can be community foundations. And they're all part of this group of actors that I was looking at. The other ones are impact investors. Hands up if anyone has heard of impact investors. Right. Impact investors are a new breed. They're a hybrid kind of an actor. They want to do good by doing and do well. And what they mean by that is they want to invest in opportunities that give economic return, but also give social impact. Okay? So it's very much a blurring of lines in terms of what the motivations are and what it is that these particular actors are trying to do. And interestingly, some of the private foundations, you might have heard, for example, some of the very old ones like Rockefeller, Ford Foundation, these are very old, right? And there's newer ones like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Some of these foundations, which were traditionally grant making, so they would give grants, and basically a grant is, I wouldn't say free money, but it's money without the expectation of a return, right? An economic return. Some of the private foundations or charitable organizations, as we see them, are starting to use impact investment as a strategy for giving. So they're using grant giving, but they're also looking how they can do something in impact investment. Okay? So those are the two particular kinds of organizations that I was looking at when I was trying to figure out, okay, who are they, what are they investing in, and where are they investing? So what I did, I was looking to ask the major question in terms of the who, the what, and the where. The why, in terms of why they're investing, where they're investing, that's a separate question. We do get into that a little bit, but it's a question on motivations, right? So it's a different kind of a question. And the other thing I was trying to do was to understand what the data are. You would be surprised to know that some of these investors have huge endowments in the hundreds and millions of dollars. Right? It's not small. It's very large money. But we have very little information, publicly available information on where they're investing, what they're doing, why they're doing it. There's a big discussion right now about transparency and this idea of who are they actually responsible to beyond the board, beyond their immediate board, who are these organizations responsible to? Who are they accountable to? So part of the project was looking to actually develop a tool that allows us to track that in an open way. Okay? So that's what this project was doing. I'm going to show you very briefly one slide, which is based on a case study of girls and women's education. Right? So one thing we did was we collected data from, I collected data on 650 private investors. Of those, roughly 100 were private foundations and impact investors. And then we tried to map where they're funding, what they're funding, and we wanted to know how much they're funding, but we couldn't because we could hardly find those data. Right? So the financial transparency, we couldn't get at. We coded all the programs, and really coding, all that means is attaching a label. It's a fancy way of saying to attach a label to a thing so that you can categorize it, right? So we coded all of these different programs and initiatives. And one thing we coded for was to see how many of those initiatives explicitly targeted girls and women's education. Why do we do this? Why did we do this? Because we know that globally, girls and women are often excluded and marginalized from prominent school systems, particularly in countries where there are high inequalities. It's also one of the priorities amongst the global community is to address this big mess. So we wanted to see, what did we find? We found that of the nearly 600 initiatives that these 100 investors were financing, only 10% focused explicitly on girls and women. Only 10%. That was shocking to us. We saw that as an underserved priority, right? That it's a stated priority. Most of these foundations and most of these impact investors say that they want to focus on the most marginalized. We want to focus on questions of equity in education. We want to focus on areas that are going to make a big impact in terms of social change. But when we looked at women and girls, only 10% of initiatives, right? That's shocking to me. The other thing we realized is that the activity in girls and women's education by these investors was concentrated in a very small number of countries. By far, India claimed the largest proportion of these initiatives. 2/3, roughly, were happening in India. And just over a tenth were happening in China. Now, one can argue that India in particular has many social inequities, and actually it's not such a bad investment to focus on India per se. But one of the questions around that then is how diverse is the private sector in terms of meeting gaps, right? Other gaps where we know that there are low-income countries in Asia that are also conflict affected, for example, Afghanistan. Okay? So that's another thing that we realized is that actually the concentration was not very strong in low-income countries. In fact, you see a lot more spread in middle-income and high-income countries, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Hong Kong, Brunei. These are not low-income countries. Okay? That's another thing we found. And the third thing we found was that the investments happened to go in places where there was already a pretty well-developed market, pretty well-developed ecosystem, we call it, technical term, right? Pretty much where there were lots of other private investors and foundations and markets growing, it attracted more investment. Okay? So again, it's the question of going back to that idea, private sector as savior, filling gaps. Is it actually filling gaps? Okay. So what are some of the themes that we're trying to uncover for further investigation? And this is very much based on the tool that we developed, right? The tool that I talked to you about earlier. We piloted the tool with 16 organizations in India, Japan, and Singapore. And we wanted to hear their feedback on the tool, but we also wanted to ask them their challenges and what they felt in terms of why they do what they do, what can we learn, and whether or not they thought that having such a tool was important or relevant to them. So I was very happy to know that they felt it was relevant. So that I was very good about. I felt really good about that. But what are some things we found? So how do they make decisions? And I think two perspectives are presented here from the quotes. One person says, we feel there's a lack of information anyway. And I remember when I was interviewing them, this person felt a little bit embarrassed, and so that was the laughter. It was like a nervous laughter, right? It wasn't a ha-ha, yay, comedy club laughter. It was more a nervous laughter. Like, oh, we feel there's a lack of information. We're trying to see if whomever has done this research for organization X in country X, because maybe they can share that information, because everybody is hoarding information. Right? So you need to be in the club to get that information, right? So for example, if I'm friends with Perry and tomorrow Perry wins, I don't know, $10 million and he sets up a foundation, and tomorrow I win $10 million and I set up a foundation, we're friends. Hey, Perry, can you let me know what's going on? Yeah, right. Can you tell me, who are you funding and why? And who? But maybe Perry won't be so open with Diana because he doesn't really know her that well. Yeah, he won't tell us. Right? So there's a question around how we exchange information, how those organizations are exchanging information among themselves, and how we as members of the public get to learn what they're doing. It's a pretty big problem. And the organizations themselves recognize that as a problem. They would like to have data. They would like to know what's happening. But they also are very hesitant in sharing that information. So there's a tension there. Now, the other thing that I found fascinating was this interviewee. This interviewee was working for a very, very high net worth foundation. And what they said was, I mean, honestly, if there's one thing I should ask people to do is to look at philanthropic capital as risk capital. You know, like risk capital. If you get a return, that's excellent. But if you don't, you're going to burn that money anyway. The idea, can you imagine having that much money? But can you actually, it blew my mind. You can hear on the transcript, I am laughing because it was again a nervous laughter. It blew my mind. I cannot imagine having that much money that I think I'm going to put in the fireplace. Anyway, so I might as well try and do some good with it, right? This idea of risk taking and burn capital, that in fact, perhaps I have excess, so I'm going to try and see what sticks. Number of ideas, I'm going to try and see what sticks. Maybe one of those 20 ideas will be something that transforms and changes. So when we think about how decisions are being made by organizations and investors, and I'm not generalizing this to every foundation, every impact investor, I'm just saying among the interviewees, when we think about decisions being made in that kind of environment, incomplete information, this culture of not being able to share, and also thinking, well, I have excess, I can just try. Then we start reassessing our claims on whether or not private sector behavior without actually having data, without actually having a plan on that. Again, I'm not generalizing this to the whole sector, but I'm saying that this is a theme that merits further investigation, broad scale investigation, to see if this is what we find, right? If we get into that. And so where do we go with that, right? What are some of the questions and issues that come up as a result of doing some of this work? Well, when we start thinking about questions of transparency, i.e. reporting and sharing information and telling us where that money is going and how it's going there and what your decision-making processes are, there are various perspectives amongst the sector, within the sector. one way is to think about it from the perspective of the grantees. That is, the investors, right? If you have money, you're gonna grant it to a particular organization that's going to implement an initiative. What does that organization have to say? Is it annoying for them to have to report? Right? One of the organizations felt that it was very difficult to keep up with the compulsions of monitoring. So even though they want to tell you where the money is going, how it's being invested, it's very hard for them. Very difficult. Puts up lots of roadblocks. They're unable to do the work that they want to do. Instead, they spend all their time reporting, right? That's one view. The other view is that actually it's not even, this is not the way we transform. This is not the way we make change. What we should have is independence. Investors should be independently authorized to invest in what they want, and the implementers should have independence to implement things in the way they want to, because we should trust that they understand the local context, that they are risk-taking, that they are nimble, that they are innovative, and that by giving them that space and giving them that opportunity, they'll be able to affect change. These are all assumptions that we are making. Yeah, we don't actually know that to be the case. Research on this is actually, in education, is actually quite minimal. So we're trying to get more information and more data around that. I mean, this was captured by, in this quote, I thought very well. And what this person said was, you want to fund a greater diversity of organizations. You want to fund a greater diversity of work. You know, let's focus on this flawed idea of reporting every dollar in the hopes of building transparency. Make investment based on trust. Focus on the big picture, not on the items. Right? This whole idea that we must trust private sector investors and the implementers to do the right thing. But it's very frustrating. You say the stated goal is to change the world, and yet the way of doing it is to count every single dollar spent. Right? This interviewee was being ironic. They are in opposition. There is no way you can do that. Now, coming from it from that angle, yes. Coming at it from our angle, where maybe, hey, we want to know what you're doing with all those millions, it causes attention. Right? So that's where we're at right now with understanding and trying to think of where to go next. Where I want to go next is to practice what I preach, is to actually develop the database that I am constructing as a public good, is to be able to put that up. And all that means is that be able to put it up somewhere online where anyone can access it free of access, so that people can go on there and see, okay, this organization is investing this. I can't invest how much money because I couldn't find it. If they're investing, this is the line of investment. This is where that money is going. This is what that money is funding, and what can we learn from that? Right? So that's the first thing I want to do. So if there are some data people here, or people who love building websites, or who love, playing with data visualization, who love apps, let me know. I would love to work with anyone who wants to do that. And the second thing where I want to go with on this research is to expand it to other regions. Right? So I started in Asia, and I would like to go to Africa, Middle East, and North Africa, right? Sub-Saharan Africa. I'd like to be able to do this in a way so that it adds and we get much more data on that and information about that. So if you're interested, you can go online and you can download the report, which is just on the tool. It doesn't talk yet about the girls and women's education investment. In fact, it's a big day. It's a double day today. We developed a brief for Global Affairs Canada based on that first map that I showed about where the girls and women's education investments are being implemented. And we presented that. My doctoral student presented that today at Global Affairs in Ottawa. As soon as that's ready, that will also be up online, so anyone can access those reports and read and see what we're doing. And if you want to talk to me about this research, you're free to email me on my university email, and I'm also on Twitter. So yeah, so I'll end there. I hope you found a nugget of something in there that you can take away. And I'd love to hear your questions. Any question you have on either the study or global education or whatever you think you'd like more information on. Thank you. Right. So one of the things we did in the database was we coded for the different kinds of initiatives, right? So girls' education, ICT, curriculum, private school delivery. But we also coded for the sector. So is it elementary? Is it secondary? Is it tertiary? So we're looking at two different things, right? We're looking to see whether the investments are being made in the appropriate sectors of education, and also whether those and where those investments are concentrated. So what the question that you're asking in terms of is language one of those areas? It certainly is one of those areas. I don't have the data off the top of my head, but yes, we do code to see if, for example, English instruction is one area that is really important in terms of the share that it captures, right? And maybe the imagination that it captures of people. And it's also a growing area because of the globalized world that we live in, and this idea that learning English, regardless of where you are, is a way of interacting more globally, right? Whether it's with the work or whether it's with travel or whatever. But the idea is that it might give extra life opportunities to certain groups of people. So certainly English programs, whether it's more traditional programming or whether it is in the form of computer-assisted instruction, apps, that's something that we're seeing. We're also seeing math as one of the areas, and to a certain extent STEM, but I would think math is a little bit more of a focus in what we're finding.
You mentioned the underserviced areas. Why is that? Why do the investors like to go with the winner?
So yeah, that's a really good question. It's also a good question for international aid generally. Why is it that low-income countries only get 30% of all aid, right? All aid that's given is only 30% goes to low-income countries. Why? And that's a decision that the OECD donors have made over time, right? So why is that? Well, in this particular analysis, I have to clarify that it was a regional analysis, right? So we're looking at actors who are operating in Asia and may also be based in Asia. So within that, what we're seeing is discrepancies within the region, generally, within the regions of South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific. We know, for example, that the domestic situation in India and China, in terms of the economy, is much stronger in Asia than other countries. And so some of the private investors that are coming up that are more regional or more domestic based are coming up also as a result of more economic transformations that have occurred. For example, if we take the case of India post-liberalization and particularly after 2000, there was a big development in the local economy and particularly in the IT sector. It became a knowledge economy for that particular one sector. And we saw as a result new investors and new actors, new private foundations, new impact investors coming up who are also attached to that change. So as a result, there's this idea or there's this conglomeration within the region in certain economies that we see are being better developed. Right? In terms of more globally, it's a more difficult question to answer. I think it's still along the same lines in terms of there are certain countries and priorities that seem to be able to attract that interest. Again, like I said, just take the case of aid, right? And as a result, you see investments. And what happens is once you see a momentum taking place, it's almost like it keeps growing in a certain instance. Afghanistan and Nepal are two low-income countries in South Asia. And Afghanistan in particular is very important because we know of what's been happening there. But also in terms of education access, it's one of the countries that requires a lot of investment. Government of Canada has very recently announced kind of an injection of investment in girls and women's education in Afghanistan. But in Nepal, I see less movement. So yeah, don't have more of an answer on that. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the questions we would love to answer is exactly going into quality, right? It's much harder to do when you're doing a global, like more of a regional mapping, because we're looking at it kind of one step removed. Uh, but certainly what we're trying to see is we're trying to look at it from a different lens. We're trying to see if the beneficiaries or the people, the target group for those investments are marginalized groups. That's why we looked at girls and women, for example, but they're not the only groups. There are other marginalized groups and indigenous peoples in the region. There are linguistic minorities. There are other, historically marginalized populations. The quality in terms of how well those programs are doing is a question of, nowadays it's being addressed as a question of impact. There's an idea that we want to make an impact with our investments. And that idea has also been infiltrating into the philanthropic space. And I'm also seeing it, so like we said, big ideas travel and discourse travels. So seeing it in university discussions, I'm seeing it in government discussions. We want to make an impact. And part of that impact is scale. So this idea that we want to go big or go home, that idea. Yeah, and part of the idea is that we really do want to have a transformational change. But the problem is that how we measure impact is not fully defined. And even for the organizations that are working in this space, they have a very hard time with coming up with indicators to allow them to assess impact, which is why there's a whole discussion about monitoring and, if we're going to spend all our time developing indicators, how are we actually going to do the work, right? Because there's only so much time, there's only so many resources, how do we do that? So that's certainly a question that some people are looking at. And where I found more, I think, success in terms of just being able to arrive at an answer to that question is in very individual studies. So there have been some case studies of individual programs, individual initiatives that really go in depth and try to understand why something worked in a particular community or why it didn't. And then we try to understand that. But the lessons or the lessons from that are hard to replicate.
Volumetric population reception and most of that's going to be far as information gathering, would it be possible to push some kind of initiative more towards the Commonwealth initiatives because we have more broadly? I know it's the information will be still limited because we really do what we do is Western Sub-Saharan Africa. That's a field that I do know that some of the Chinese investors have pulled out of certain very early investments in Sub-Saharan Africa because they failed to see a financial return on some of their investments. It literally reflects on the amount of borders begins very fast within very income within. So one of the measures that any corporation investor is going to have is the lower return on
Return on investment.
So how do you balance that against the social aspect?
Yes.
And I know these aren't questions
No.
I expect, and but they are questions that are everything as far as the Commonwealth relations. I think there should be some kind of education here to get more because that would maybe get more transparency with that we can put back to common understanding that we need transparency in that respect. The combination with the current arguments in the states versus the judge
Mm-hmm.
currently they have a firewall of don't look inside of company like you're allowed to see everything that's outside of corporate
Mm-hmm.
and nothing further. You're going to have major issues in the future if we don't challenge that in some sort of transparency versus its current. Okay, it's Google, it's everything, it's every facet of community. And Toronto has people,
Smart city.
smart city. Um, if that succeeds and it becomes replicated or reproducible, it could be replicated in several cities and then become, like you said, every day, just be in the background. But I think we can utilize technologies more in some of these areas with next capabilities. We give some of these communities remote access to teachers that may not have local teachers.
Right. So you addressed a number of points. I think the first question around rate of return or ROI is rate of return on investment. For philanthropic organizations that are operating on a grant making charitable basis, which is a number of private foundations are doing that, and even the ones that are experimenting with impact investment, it's not their largest portfolio. The largest portfolio still tends to be grant making. There is no economic expectation of return. What they want to see is this impact, right? Is again this ugly affected change. For impact investment, there is an expectation of return. Typically, but there's no line that's been set by which you say, okay, under say 10%, it's impact investment, and over 10%, we just then will think that this is for profit investment, right? There isn't a set amount that anyone has come up with, but typically what I've seen from the research is you're looking at around 5 to 10% is uh, is kind of being played around with in terms of an ROI on impact investment in education. Having said that, in education, most of the impact investors that are investing in education will say that they do not expect even that high a return. They do expect a return, but it might not be as high as in other sectors, and they expect it would take a longer amount of time to achieve it. So there's that question. The other question on transparency, I mean, unfortunately, the thing about private investment and transparency is that, well, who are those actors accountable to, right? They're not actually accountable to the Commonwealth. They're not actually accountable to whatever. They might be they are accountable to their board if we're talking about philanthropies. They're accountable to their shareholders if we're talking about for-profit companies. They are accountable to domestic governments in as much as they are accountable in terms of their tax laws, and if there are laws on business, fair business practices, that wouldn't apply to a charity, but it would certainly apply to a for-profit investor. So the question then becomes, where can we take these bigger questions around, hey, we need to have these data? And that's a really good question. My feeling is that there's two ways of doing this. One is citizen engagement, and really having citizens in countries to start asking these questions in a very mobilized way, right? It's to say, okay, we want to know what we're doing. And the second way is perhaps through this idea of linking with networks. There are often networks and organizations, organizing bodies of private investors and other investors. And maybe if there are certain networks that are interested in taking this on, because even the sector would like to have data, even organizations operating in this would like to know who's doing what, where, and with whom, right? These are basic things. So maybe there's a way of pushing it through that way. But we're very early days, very, very early days in where we are with that. So thanks for raising those questions. Mm-hmm. Right. So it was the initiatives. 10% of the initiatives were on Girls in Women, and yes, the majority of those were financed in partnership. Well, this is the interest. That's a really good question. I'll tell you why. Because we were looking at a set number of private foundations and impact investors, and in our list, in our sample, we had like 90% of them, because of how, just who we were able to find and track, were private foundations. But what's interesting about that is that most initiatives are co-financed, and they're co-financed in partnerships with other investors. Some of those investors are other charitable organizations or not-for-profit organizations. Sometimes they are for-profit companies, and sometimes they're also government departments, and sometimes they're international government aid or donors, international donors. So the next part of what we're doing here is exactly that question. It's actually quite a tangled web. It's not the case that one initiative is financed solely by one investor. In fact, like I said, we had 100 private foundations and impact investors. We had 600 initiatives. Well, we actually in the database have 1,200, but we're doing the analysis on around 600. And we have around 5,000 co-financers. That's huge. So you can see that, in fact, the financing structure is, again, it's this blurring that we were talking about, right? There's a blurring in terms of the actors that they're partnering with. Sometimes it's for-profit and non-for-profit and government and international donors and multilateral agencies. Multilateral is really just the World Bank, large, institutions that finance multiple countries once. Yeah, IFIs. Yeah, IFIs, and sometimes it's so that is what we want to look at next. Is who are the partners? What do the partners look like? And in fact, the brief that I mentioned, the one on girls and women's education, that one we do actually extract because it was for global affairs, and one of their interests is to understand who are the donors, the international assistance donors, and who are the other multilateral organizations that are also investing in girls' education. So who did we find in these partnerships? And that brief extracts that a little more. About 10% of the girls and women's education initiatives were co-financed in partnership with another donor, with an international donor. Yeah, really good question. Yeah. Okay, you had your hand up.
My sense from the things you said so far is I don't get a good sense. And I have a feeling you're going to keep digging up more stuff, but you don't get a good sense. Do you find that just generally?
Mhm.
Because it doesn't get anything about
There's certainly a concern, and in fact, in the last 5 years or so, there's a global movement that is led by global civil society around commercialization of education and commercialization in education globally. And there's a campaign that's being run by Education International, which is a large federation of unions. So it's a federation of federations. Also pretty cool. You can look that up. And there are a number of other initiatives that are occurring as a result of exactly these kinds of concerns. There are also some positive stories that are coming out. Again, it's only in the last couple of years that this is changing. Is that there have been some donors that were also part of partnerships in certain countries that financed for-profit companies in education. And this was also being supported not only by private investors, but also by donors, right? And that caused a huge controversy, particularly in the case of the UK, for example, because we had public taxpayers saying, why are our public taxpaying money, which is supposed to go for aid, why is it going to initiatives that are also for-profit initiatives in countries that have huge gaps, and why is that happening? So there was an inquiry that happened in the UK into that. It was a formal inquiry. It's all available, public information. One of the European Commission, which is the organizing body for the EU, they also, the member of the European Parliament came out with a declaration or a motion to say that none of their official aid money is going to go to support commercial for-profit providers in education. The Global Partnership for Education, which is which is actually the largest fund right now, I think it's the largest fund, for education in low-income countries, and also has priorities for fragile or conflict-affected areas. They also very recently came out with a private sector strategy just 3 months ago that said the same thing, that GPE official monies will not go to core provide education who are profit-oriented. So there are changes that are happening. There is more pressure on certain domestic governments to invest more in education. People are looking at taxation. For example, when you are a foreign company doing business in country X, say, I don't know, say it's Uganda, okay, I just like out of the top of my head. Where is that money? Is that money actually being domiciled in Uganda? going outside. Is that money creating jobs in Uganda? Or is that money coming back to whatever country X? What are the taxation implications? How much money, tax justice is an international tax justice is a movement that's being developed by global civil society to ask exactly those questions. Where is that investment going? What is happening with those profits? Where is it? And how many billions of dollars are being lost through these kinds of what people say are unfair tax mechanisms? So I agree with you, but I think there is some positive notions there. I think where there are complications is the opaqueness and also this tangled association between different kinds of actors.
I hate to interrupt now because the discussion is just getting into the dirty, juicy, controversial ones. If people are interested in following up on kind of the critical aspects of this issue, is this a good place for them to start reading?
Well, yeah, I mean, they can. That one is basically the report. I've written a few blog posts that have gained some traction on these issues with the Oxfam poverty blog that they have. And all of this stuff is available on my website, on Twitter. I'm very publicly open. I'm trying to, as much as I can, engage, as much as I can, mobilize the research so that people are aware of what's happening.
So I'd like to thank you for doing our talk tonight.
Ooh.
That was really interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. Beautiful.
We'll be back again in the spring with another speaker from the Faculty of Education. And I'd encourage you, you still have lots of food at the back, right? So grab it and take it home with you, because otherwise we'll just be taking it out. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. Thank you so much.